501c4 think tank based in Washington, D.C., and our focus as an organization is on human dignity. Does anyone have an idea of what human dignity is? Anyone want to try and explain it? So basically, human dignity is the notion that we are all created by God, and because of that, we have certain rights that can't be taken away by man. And that when man and government take away those rights and those abilities, that there are consequences to those, negative consequences. And we focus on promoting human dignity through many different aspects. We fight to protect the unborn and their right to life. We fight to protect religious freedom and people's ability to practice their religion openly in the public. We also fight to give parents more educational control with their children by fighting the Common Core. We were one of the main groups that started that fight. But today, and what's relevant to our organization, is the Federal Reserve and monetary policy. And we come at it from a standpoint that monetary policy directly affects the economy, it affects wages, it affects job growth, it affects our society at large. And when you have certain monetary policies implemented, it affects workers' paychecks. And so we want to protect the dignity of workers, protect the fruits of their labors, and get a stable, sound monetary policy that protects everyone. So before I begin, I just kind of want to gauge everyone's interest and see who's kind of in the room here. How many of you would say that you're familiar, not an expert, but familiar with monetary policy? Just raise your hand. Excellent, excellent. And how many of you are familiar with how the Federal Reserve operates? Excellent. Well, you probably might know more than me. I'm just kidding. How many of you have a preferred monetary reform that you would support? A rule or anything like that? How many of you guys think that the Federal Reserve is doing a good job at managing our economy? Well, that's probably why you're all here today. So why does monetary policy matter? As I said earlier, monetary policy affects economic growth, it affects the growth of government, it affects wages, it affects jobs, and in turn it affects innovation and investment. Capital, that's all affected. Money is, if you think about it, money is really the lifeblood of our economy and our society. If you don't have healthy money and a good monetary system, you're going to suffer consequences. You're not going to have a healthy economy. Steve Forbes, do we have any Steve Forbes fans in the room? I'm a big Steve Forbes fan. He said that if you can get it right on everything, you can get it right on tax policy, you can get it right on healthcare, you can get it right on regulatory policy, you can get it right on everything. But if you get the money wrong, it's all for naught. And what I think that what he's getting at is that just as if you have unhealthy blood and you're running through your body, you're going to have problems with your digestive system, you're going to have problems with your brain, you're going to have problems with your lungs. It's going to affect your entire body. So it's really important that we get it right. Just at a 50,000 foot level, I do want to show you guys something. I have a video of my first experience when I was learning monetary policy that I'd like to show you guys. That was me. A little bit heavier there. And, I got LASIK eye surgery. Sorry, that's my poor attempt at humor. Okay, so we'll get back on track. So basically, how many of you are familiar with George Gilder? 1980s. Actually, he's a prophet in many different areas. George Gilder wrote the Bible of Reaganomics. He wrote Wealth and Poverty in the 1980s, and Ronald Reagan used it when he was implementing his tax reform and supply-side economic theories. George Gilder, we're working with him right now, and he's coming out with a book, and I was reading it last night, and there was a quote that I'd like to share with all you that I think illustrates the problem that I think that we're facing right now. And George Gilder wrote, "To prosper, Silicon Valley, Main Street, and Wall Street need to work together. But our misplaced faith in the power of the Federal Reserve to order growth into being by manipulating its monopoly money has led to the capture of Wall Street by Washington and the subsequent starvation of Main Street and Silicon Valley. Understanding the real sources of our economic crisis requires surrendering our faith that the Fed has the answers. This is the key not just to political victory, but to restoring the American dream. So let me get back here. What is the Federal Reserve's role in our economy? The Federal Reserve conducts monetary policy on behalf of the United States. What does that mean? That means that they set they target monetary, the money supply through different tools. They have 3 different tools that they use. They have open market operations, and where they purchase and sell securities to increase or decrease the money supply. And they can also control reserve requirements. They also control the federal discount rate. Primarily, though, they use the open market operations. But the Federal Reserve right now, in its role, is operating as our central economic planner. Their idea is that they can use monetary policy to stimulate the economy and to get growth through artificially low interest rates, and that when inflation gets out of control, that they can lower or increase interest rates to combat inflation. In my opinion, under its current structure, the Federal Reserve is an antiquated, outdated system that was designed during an era where the top-down structure and system was prevalent and worked best. So what are the different types of monetary policy that you can have? There are different ways that you can set monetary policy. The first is discretionary policy, and that's what we currently have. So basically, the Federal Reserve is free to set monetary policy how they see fit. They base it, right now they operate under a dual mandate from Congress, where their goal is to maximize employment and ensure stable prices. They don't always have, they're mandated by law, but they're a private entity and no one holds them accountable to it. So they can, just because you have a dual mandate doesn't mean that they change anything. They're still going to do whatever they want. Proponents of this system argue that it's a flexible system that's necessary to deal with our complicated economy. They argue that the U.S. economy is so complicated that you need a group of experts here to manage the economy, to manage the money supply. Opponents of it argue that the experts are wrong and they can never be 100% right. They're trying to predict the future and they just can't do it accurately, and that it has bad consequences on the economy. They also argue that it's too much power for any group of people to have. They argue it's closer to oligarchy than anything. The other way that the Fed operates, that monetary policy can operate, is through rules. There are many different rules. I can go into them, but I'll leave that for the question and answer session. But you can target inflation, you can target interest rates, you can target growth, you can target commodities like gold or a basket of commodities. There's many different ways, but proponents of the rules-based system argue that it allows, that it's a more free market solution, that it takes away human error, and that it allows for the free market to set interest rates and the money supply, which is a much better system than allowing experts at a central planning agency to manipulate the money supply. In my opinion, what the ideal monetary policy would do is it would allow equal access to capital. It wouldn't pick winners and losers. And what do I mean by that? So since the 2008 crisis, the Federal Reserve has targeted interest rates near zero. They recently announced that they would be raising interest rates. So basically what they're doing is they're instituting a price control. How many people know what happens when you institute price controls? Okay. When price controls are implemented and the prices are artificially low, so you're handing out something for free, basically. So the zero interest rate policy, they're holding interest rates, trying to hold them near zero. What happens? Excuse me? You get shortages. Exactly. A line forms. And in our economy, what happens is a line forms. George Gilder refers to it as a queue. And a line forms, and the Fed basically picks winners and losers. So you have the most politically connected, the most powerful people getting access to capital in spite of people that are on Main Street and on Silicon Valley in their garages forming the next Apple or the next BMW. So that's my problem with it. It would also be based on the free market, and it would naturally ebb and flow. So it would increase or reduce the money supply based on the demands of the free market. It wouldn't go off of what Janet Yellen or Ben Bernanke or even President Obama think is best for the economy. It would go off of what the free market as a whole thinks is best for the economy and what they're demanding to avoid the queues and to avoid oversupply as well. And it would be based on free market principles as to avoid conflicting with the controlled market. Yes? So basically, when you go to seek for a loan, I guess it just depends on what your credit rating is. But when you're investing in small businesses, and after the talk, I can send you reports about access to capital. There have been lots of surveys that have showed that small to medium-sized businesses, report having trouble accessing capital in the way that larger corporations don't. So basically, there's only so much money you can loan out. There's only so much money that's available for printing. And what happens when the interest rates are near zero is Apple comes in and they refinance their debt, and they do stock buyback programs, which inflates the prices of their stock, and that's less capital that's available to new and upcoming businesses. So when you go to buy a house, that's not as restricted as when you go to start a business, if that makes sense. But I'm almost done with just a few things, and then we can open up to questions. But no, I think it's a great question. Again, it would be based on free market principles, avoid conflicting with a controlled market. It would naturally reduce and increase money supply based on demands of the free market to avoid bubbles and busts and produce less market distortions. And it would allow for equal access for all to capital. So basically, interest rates would be set by the free market so that if you are a riskier business, you can get a higher rate interest rate, or you can get higher interest rates, and it's not, banks aren't afraid to loan to you at 20% because they can. Whereas under the lower interest rate policy, banks don't want to loan out to risky businesses because it's at 3%, 4%, 5% on a risky business. So what can we do to reform monetary policy in the United States? The first thing that we think at an American Principles Project that we should do is to establish a monetary commission. The Bank of England did a monetary commission earlier in I think it was 2008 or 2009. And what they produced a report, and it showed they analyzed all the monetary policy that they had implemented over the past years, and they came to a solution for reforming their policy there. And what we'd like to do is do the same thing here. Federal Reserve has been around for just over 100 years. We'd like to take a look at the different policies that they've implemented. You know, not a lot of people know this, but there are like 4 or 5 different gold standards that we've had. We've had the classical gold standard, we've had the interwar gold standard, we had the gold exchange standard, we had Bretton Woods, and then, you get to 1971, we're officially off the gold window, and we're on discretionary, and you have Paul Volcker versus Alan Greenspan versus Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke. So what we'd like to do is do a commission to look at the results of those of those monetary policies and see how the economy fared under each one of those, and see what the system was like, and then produce a recommendation going forward for a new 21st century monetary policy. An easy next step would be to open the Fed up to competition. And they can do this very easily through removing taxes on competitive currencies. So not a lot of people know this, but the Federal Reserve, I'm sorry, not the Federal Reserve, the IRS taxes. Does anyone here have silver eagles or gold eagles? I do. So if you buy a silver eagle at $15, and the Federal Reserve does a bunch of printing, and next year that silver eagle is worth $20, you're taxed on that $5 gain. you have to pay, I think it's a 40% tax on that. And so what we think we should do is remove the taxes on that to allow people to use gold and silver coins to purchase things. So you could take I think a gold eagle right now is worth $1,300, $1,400, and you could use that to buy something. You could use one gold eagle to buy something, and not pay taxes on the gains. Or even you can do Bitcoin. I've used Bitcoin in the past. It's all right. I think it just needs more time to prove itself and to gain credibility and be more stable. And I think that, at the end of this, by the time this is all done, the Monetary Commission will be completed, and we can make a reform based on the findings of that, whether it's a Taylor rule or nominal gross domestic product targeting or the gold standard or whatever. So that's the long and short of it. I really wanted to have a conversation today, and I'll be very frank. I might not have all the answers today, but I think it's really important that we have a conversation and keep it going. And my biggest problem with monetary policy is that it doesn't get enough attention. It takes a back seat to tax policy, takes a back seat to regulatory policy and healthcare. And it is just such an important issue because it affects all of those. When the Fed devalues our dollar, they get to collect more tax revenue. It affects everything. So I will open it up to questions. Yes. Right. There are different schools of thought, and there are free marketists that argue that the gold standard did not cause the Great Depression, and that actually I don't know. I'll have to get back to you on that. I'm not an expert on 1930s monetary policy, but yeah. So we can talk after this. And yeah, and what I would argue is that the one thing that that the monetarists miss is they factor in velocity, so how much money moves through an economy as a constant, but that's not the case. The velocity is not a constant. And I mean, what is velocity, right? It's people deciding to use their money. So you can't force people to spend their money. And in times of uncertainty, they might not hoard gold anymore, but they'll hoard dollars, and they're not going to spend it, and they're going to pull it out of their banks or stocks or whatever. So what I would argue is that there's a key flaw, and that's what George Gilder argued. He wrote a monograph, and he followed it up with a book that's coming out. And I'd actually like to send you a copy of the book. It's called Scandal. Why Wall Street recovered, the scandal of money, why Wall Street recovered, but Main Street never did. But I'll get you a copy of it. But yeah, so the big thing is that the government can't control the velocity at which people spend their money. They can't control individual behavior. People are still able to decide how they operate. And just because the Fed decides to target interest rates at a certain level, it doesn't mean that they're actually going to go that way. And I think the recent news stories that I've read is that when the Fed started talking about increasing interest rates, there were a lot of people saying, we actually don't know if they can do that. We don't know if it's actually going to work that way. So I would love to have another conversation about 1930s. I find this stuff fascinating, but I am not an expert on that just yet. I do think that there are obviously natural ebbs and flows under a gold standard and under a free market currency, but in the long run, the growth is more stable. The economy grows at a much better rate. Under the classical gold standard from 1870 to 1914, we had 4% economic growth on average every year. That accounts for the booms and busts. Under the current Fed regime of discretionary monetary policy since 1971, we've averaged, I believe, it's either 3% or 3.2%, depending on if the last I had done this and it was 3%, but that was 2 years ago. The last I had actually analyzed that. So it doesn't sound like a lot. It's only 1% difference, but you compound that, and it's actually 25% less growth every year, compounded. So 3% versus 4% actually makes a big difference. Steve Forbes actually argues that had we sustained the level of growth under the gold standard that we had at 4%, the economy would be 50% bigger. I mean, think about that. We have to have both parents working today just to make ends meet. We wouldn't have that problem. Well, we might still, but there are other supply side factors that affect that. But yeah, I'd love to talk after this and make sure I can get you a copy of George Gilder's new book. Yes.
I'm not saying it's a bad idea, but I've learned to be very skeptical about commissions and councils and agencies. So I'm not saying it's a bad idea, but how do you really use council the commission is?
Yeah, that's a great point. There's actually a bill right now in the Senate and in Congress. It's called the Centennial Monetary Commission. I think they need to change the name though, because it was done first done in 2013, the 100-year anniversary of the Fed. I think it's SB 46. I can I'll get it to you after this. So that stipulates it's basically members of the Joint Economic Committee. It's members of Congress. I can't remember all of the makeup of the committee, but it's pretty solid and it's very fact based. It's not there are politicians that are in charge of it. So politicians do take advantage of things, but they can still be held accountable for what they do on this commission. But even so, the findings are non-binding, so the Fed would not necessarily have to be reformed based on the findings of this commission. It would just help monetary reform advocates arguing for reforms to be able to cite a commission or a study done by our own government on the best monetary policy going forward. Yes.
According to several economists, about 67% of our economic growth is consumer spending.
Right.
And they're concerned that having a deflationary monetary policy would put off some of that consumer spending to a later date. Do you think that mild deflation is as bad as people make it out to be, or do you think it's somewhat innocuous?
I do think, look, I would be concerned about deflation, especially in a time where we're trying to get out of the rut that was caused in 2008. But I also think that there are other factors to take into consideration besides just immediate short-term growth. I think that how the Federal Reserve conducts its monetary policy also affects how people invest their capital, invest their money. So George Gilder in his book, when he argues that the Federal Reserve is starving out Silicon Valley and Main Street, what he's arguing is that the Federal Reserve, that Silicon Valley firms that are starting the next Apple or the next big thing that's going to change this country, they're not able to do it because they can't get the capital because it's going to Apple and Citibank and these big corporations that are safe investments and will return the money at the low interest rates. But we can also talk after this about that. I have 1 minute left, so yes.
Could you address for a few moments the conspiracy theories dating back to Bretton Woods in 1913 and that the Fed is actually a private corporation
Mm-hmm.
versus possibility of having new U.S. Treasury notes and getting rid of the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, so I am not that knowledgeable about the different theories about the Fed. However, there's a book by Ben Steele called The Battle for Bretton Woods, and it's a great book. It's written kind of like a thriller novel, which is very odd to find a thriller novel intermixed with monetary policy. But in this book, he uncovers that at Bretton Woods, the guy that was in charge of setting up the new Bretton Woods system was actually a Soviet agent that was in the American government. It's really fascinating, but you should all look it up. Ben Steele, The Battle for Bretton Woods. It's great.
Do you
I don't have any information about that. We're going to have to work really hard to implement any type of reforms for the Federal Reserve and how the U.S. implements its monetary policy. The main problem that I see is that it's directly connected to people, but it's invisible, right? So when the Fed sets monetary policy, it's not as blatant and it's not as obvious as tax, when they increase taxes or increase regulations. So I just want to do this to increase exposure for the Federal Reserve and how important it is to get the right monetary policy. But we can also talk after this. But all right, I think Joe's telling me I have to wrap it up. So thank you guys. I'll be around outside to talk.